Okay, so but that's
I mean, you take a look at the Antifa riots throughout the Pacific Northwest. We just learned there was an investigation that found 31 of 90 had their charges dropped and many dismissed with prejudice, which, according to one expert, this is extremely rare for them to actually do this. Some of these were felony charges where Antifa literally assaulted an officer. Their charges are dropped. Now, when it comes to the out group, which would be these, Trump supporters at the Capitol, you have the instance of some people. This is really interesting because I'm seeing journalists say this. The shaman guy with the horns, apparently he argued in court, the cops waved him in. And it's on video. The cops are waving, and people are following the cops waving, and then the cops open the door. Not everybody who went in the building were shoving their way through police and fighting with cops. There were many circumstances where the doors were just opened up. Now, I think, obviously, everybody who went in the building was dumb, and it was a huge mistake for these people. But you take a look at how, after, 6-7 months of rioting and cities being burned down, and these Antifa people, I mean, the vice president was soliciting donations to bail her out. So we can say there's no legal mechanism in a sense, but there is a cultural mechanism that guarantees if you're far leftist and you burn down a city, it is very likely that you will face no cultural repercussions. Or none whatsoever. I mean, they're not being targeted by law enforcement as terrorists. They're being, the vice president's raising money. Joe Biden's own staffers were raising money to get them out. But if you're a Trump supporter who was just in D.C., you're this woman, she's a psychological operations officer in the Army. She was simply attending a speech. She's under investigation. One guy was a rapper. He's an artist. His label dropped him for simply being in D.C. when this happened. So that's what's scary to me. We can say, oh, but we have a constitution. Sure, but what happens when the federal government just lies? And then you have the entirety of the establishment Democratic left saying, good. They want to do a commission on these people now. I think maybe the fear is perhaps a bit pessimistic, but maybe the fear is that they learn from what these other countries did and how to avoid, falling into certain traps. They don't want to kill people. They want control. They don't want to look like the villains themselves, especially in an age of social media and instant transmission of information. So they use clever manipulation to make sure their political dissidents are stripped, destroyed, and removed. And that's what's happening.
I do think that it is different in the U.S. Like, if the Cultural Revolution happened in the U.S., it could not happen the same way that it happened in China, because we do not have it's not like
we have guns.
Well, besides that, like, the whole mechanism is like started in China by the state. Like, it's started by the Chinese Communist Party. It's like top down. But like
also the cult of personality Mao had, which doesn't exist.
But you're saying there's no cult of personality around Biden.
I think that, like, in the U.S., the mechanism is like, if you have these tech companies, if you have like the Democratic Party, or like you have this like cultural mechanism for it that is like a different manifestation, but it could, like, psychologically there are similarities, I would say, and especially in terms of like things like the reporting on people, there are things that could happen with this cancel culture stuff that's going on that could follow like the course of the Cultural Revolution without being a thing that is done by or done by the state exactly, or like, but it could have like the same. You could have neighborhood watch committees where everybody's looking at whatever, you're pulling up what you said on Twitter 20 years ago.
Perhaps we're just not at that stage of what the Cultural Revolution was yet, but we do have, just recently it was Christopher Wray, I believe it was FBI, saying, domestic terror coming, I don't know if he specifically called out Trump supporters, but I think he said, far right domestic terror is the biggest threat we're facing. You've got the Democrats saying Trump supporters and QAnon, they're claiming that they need to keep these troops surrounding D.C. with razor wire fences and razor wire and these fences because of these conspiracy theories about Trump's true inauguration. You are getting from mainstream press a narrative over and over and over again of who the evil is. Calling for, they're calling it the 1-6 Commission. They want a 9/11 style commission on what happened at the Capitol. They're acting like it was on par with 9/11. And they're continually demonizing Trump supporters, populist right-wingers, conservatives, to the point where, we've mentioned it several times now, Echelon Insights interviewed Democrats. What is, of these things, how would you rate your level of concern? The top concern among Democrats is Trump supporters, white nationalists, white supremacy, and among Trump supporters, or among Republicans, it's illegal immigration, taxation, support for the police, very run-of-the-mill conservative positions. It seems like the narrative we're getting from the mainstream press about how bad and awful the right is in this country is reaching that level where, I mean, people, I think, are ready to burst and go insane. So perhaps it's not the point where you'll see Red Guard going around literally murdering people. But we are getting to that point where I believe it's entirely possible you will see the Democrats come out and straight up say, arrest them all, every single one. Because we're already getting to that point. Nicole Wallace on MSNBC said if they were in a different country, would have blown them up by now with a drone strike. What, wouldn't Mitch McConnell think Trump should be arrested for what he did? We have an article from The Root where they said Republicans are enemy combatants, that we must treat as enemy combatants. The Root in 2018, according to Newswhip, was the #1 publication on the left. Now, the right got substantially more engagements, but they were still #1. What happens when you have prominent Democratic politicians, people like Ocasio-Cortez saying, Ted Cruz, you tried to get me murdered. And they're telling this to people over and over again. Where do we go in a year? Perhaps right now we're saying, oh, but in the Cultural Revolution, they were called upon by the party, by the political figures to go and do these things. And it's like, okay, well, maybe in a year they do that. Maybe in 2 years, 3 years. All I know is right now I'm constantly being told by the press how Trump is an insurrectionist who tried to overthrow the United States government. And YouTube has deleted every iteration of his speech from CPAC. This level of tribalist demonization isn't stopping. It's escalating. It's getting worse. And it seems to me like we are dangerously close to this point where the hysteria reaches this level. Perhaps we have a president in Joe Biden who he's already failing his first test in the migrant crisis. The left is outraged over his migrant detention centers for children. The right is outraged over his releasing of COVID-positive patients, COVID-positive illegal immigrants into Texas, as well as shutting down Trump's border wall. So now you've got both sides angry with him. He didn't get the stimulus checks out. Are we potentially looking at a pathetic and failed leader who causes widespread, demoralization among even moderates in this country that results in a Donald Trump running again in 2024 against a Kamala Harris who does not have the charisma to win? Trump ends up getting a decisive but slim victory. And then you have all of that conditioning over 4 years of the demons, of the insurrectionists. Trump finally completed his insurrection. He took the country over. We must go. We must purge. We must stop this. Or perhaps it goes the other way. Trump becomes president and says they're the bad guys. They're the ones trying to subvert it. Like the hyperpolarization is getting just that scary to me.
Well, democracy is very fragile. And, you know, you were mentioning the commission making the comparison to 9/11. Well, what's the lesson of 9/11? The government used terrorism to create the Patriot Act, which was really more about making the government more powerful and taking away the rights of the American people.
I mean, right? It's about power and control, and what you kind of just described